The year was 1962, and the setting was the sleepy, agricultural heart of rural Bavaria, near the Austrian border. The war had been over for 17 years, but the landscape still held physical scars. Overgrown tank traps in the forests and a pervasive silence among the older generation. It was a late autumn afternoon, the kind where a cold, pervasive fog begins to lift from the recently harvested fields. For Johann, a second-generation farmer whose family had worked this land since the Napoleonic Wars, the priority was not history, but hydraulics. His primary tractor, a pre-war machine that was more rust than iron, had sheared its main hydraulic piston just as the fields were ready for plowing. Johann was a pragmatic man. If you needed something fixed, you didn't buy a new part. You found an old machine to cannibalize. He remembered that his grandfather had, in the final chaotic months of 1945, purchased a large, disused aircraft storage shed on the edge of the property from a desperate local contractor. It was known simply as the Upper Barn, and it had remained padlocked and largely ignored for nearly 2 decades. Johann's grandfather had claimed it contained only surplus aviation oil and junked aluminum, none of it useful for farming. But Johann, driven by necessity, decided to investigate for himself. He found the key, a massive, rusted skeleton key, and struggled against the stiff, corroded padlock. The oak doors, dried and warped by the Bavarian weather, groaned in protest. He had expected dust. He had expected spiders. He had expected to see a few metal crates and perhaps the collapsed skeleton of an old training glider. But as the heavy doors finally swung open, the afternoon light pierced a gloom that had been undisturbed since May 1945. Johann stepped inside, his work boots cracking on dust that had turned to a fine, grey silt. The first thing that hit him wasn't dust. It was the smell. It was an unmistakable mixture of ozone, high-grade synthetic grease, and the cold metallic tang of aviation fuel, a scent completely foreign to a farm. As the fog cleared and the light pushed deeper into the shed, the object revealed itself. It sat low and wide on tricycle landing gear, a position utterly alien compared to the high-set taildraggers of that era. There were no propeller hubs. Johann was staring into the gaping mouth of a black, oval air intake. He blinked, thinking he was hallucinating in the bad light. This was not junked aluminum. It was a Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. It wasn't just a shell. It was complete, seemingly perfect, its elegant, swept-back lines reflecting the limited light like a weapon that had only just been holstered. Johann stood paralyzed, the sheared hydraulic piston forgotten in his hand, realizing that the upper barn contained a secret far bigger than any tractor part. Johann took a tentative step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He half expected a ghost to emerge from the cockpit or a long-dormant alarm to scream through the rafters. But the barn remained silent, save for the rhythmic dripping of condensation from the corrugated roof. As he approached the fuselage of the Messerschmitt, he realized why the machine looked so impossibly pristine. The jet wasn't merely parked, it had been entombed with a level of care that bordered on the obsessive. Every sensitive orifice of the Jumo 004 engines, the gaping front intakes and the tapered rear exhausts, had been plugged with custom-fitted wooden bungs and sealed with heavy, wax-impregnated tape. The entire airframe was coated in a thick, translucent layer of cosmoline, a brownish, jelly-like preservative grease used by the military to prevent rust. In the dim light, the aircraft shimmered like an insect preserved in amber. Hanging from the rafters were massive, moth-eaten sheets of heavy canvas that had once draped the entire wingspan, likely falling away over the decades as the ropes rotted. Johann reached out and touched the leading edge of the swept wing. His fingers came away coated in a sticky, amber residue, but beneath the grease, the RLM 76 light blue paint was as vibrant as the day it left the factory in Regensburg. He climbed a rickety wooden ladder leaning against a hayloft to get a better look at the cockpit. The canopy glass, though covered in a fine layer of grey silt, was miraculously uncracked. He wiped a small circle clear with his sleeve and peered inside. The interior was a masterclass in German engineering forensics. The Revi 16B gun sight was still mounted on its bracket. The leather on the pilot seat was supple, not cracked by the dry rot that usually claims abandoned aircraft. Even the oxygen mask was still draped over the control column. But the most striking detail was the smell, a sharp, chemical tang that suggested the fuel tanks hadn't just been drained, they had been flushed with the preservative spirits that had kept the rubber seals from perishing. Johann realized this wasn't a discarded weapon of war. This was a hidden one. Someone had spent days, perhaps weeks, meticulously preparing this machine for a long sleep. They hadn't just walked away from it, they had protected it from the very air that would have destroyed it. On the side of the fuselage, beneath the heavy grease, he could see the faint outline of a white 7, and a small, stylized crest, a galloping horse. As a farmer, Johann knew the look of something being kept for a later harvest. This jet was a seed, planted in the dock of a Bavarian barn, waiting for a spring that its owners hoped would eventually come. But who had the keys to this harvest, and why had they never returned to claim it? The discovery of a pristine jet fighter in a Bavarian barn in 1962 was not something that could stay a secret for long, especially once Johann sought professional help to identify the strange tractor parts. Within days, the local police were replaced by men in suits from the West German Ministry of Defense and aviation historians from Munich. The barn, once a quiet corner of a family farm, became a high-security investigative site. The primary question was logistical. How does a 12-meter-wide jet aircraft with swept wings vanish into a wooden shed without leaving a trace? As the investigators scraped away layers of grease and dust, they began to reconstruct the final days of April 1945. They found a series of camouflaged, heavy-duty wooden ramps buried under 20 years of hay and rotted timber. These ramps led from the barn's rear doors to a narrow, straight stretch of the local farm road, a road that, during the war, had been widened and reinforced with crushed stone. This wasn't a crash landing, one historian noted, running a hand over the smooth underside of the fuselage. She was taxied in under her own power. The investigation then turned to the village records. In 1945, the region had been a chaotic funnel for retreating Luftwaffe units trying to stay ahead of the advancing Soviet Red Army from the east and the Americans from the west. They discovered a requisition order from a special technical unit that had occupied the farm for 3 days in May. The unit hadn't been a combat squadron, it was a group of engineers and test pilots. The most startling piece of evidence was found tucked into the pilot's map case, a flight plan dated May 7, 1945, one day before the official German surrender. The destination wasn't Berlin or a frontline base. The coordinates pointed to a remote alpine meadow. Then, the white 7 markings and the galloping horse crest provided the final link. This aircraft belonged to Jagdverband 44, the legendary Squadron of Experts. But this specific machine, work number 111711, had been pulled from the line for a specific purpose. Through a series of interviews with elderly villagers, a story began to emerge of a ghost flight that arrived at dusk. A lone jet had roared over the treetops, landing on the reinforced farm road with its engines screaming in the twilight. A team of men had been waiting with the grease, the canvas, and the wooden bungs. They worked through the night, not to hide a weapon for a werewolf insurgency, but to prevent it from falling into the hands of the encroaching Soviet forces. The investigation revealed that the farmer's grandfather hadn't just bought the shed, he had been paid in gold marks to act as a silent guardian. The upper barn wasn't a storage unit, it was a high-tech vault, and the contractor who sold it to him was a high-ranking Luftwaffe officer who had vanished into the post-war mist. The investigation eventually led the authorities to a modest apartment in Munich, where an elderly man with steady hands and piercing blue eyes lived a quiet life as a retired mechanical engineer. His name was Karl-Heinz, a former Luftwaffe Oberleutnant and a high-altitude test pilot who had been part of the elite Squadron of Experts. When shown the photographs of the jet in the barn, Karl-Heinz didn't act surprised. He simply sat back, lit a pipe, and whispered, "So, she finally woke up." Karl-Heinz revealed that in late April 1945, the Luftwaffe High Command was in a state of terminal fracture. The primary directive was to prevent Germany's advanced jet technology from falling into Soviet hands. While Operation Paperclip was already being whispered about among the Americans, the pilots on the Eastern Front faced a much grimmer reality. Capture by the Red Army meant certain death or a lifetime in a Siberian gulag. "We were told to scuttle the jets," Karl-Heinz recounted, his voice thick with the memory of the final days. "Blow them up, burn the engines, leave nothing but scrap." But White 7 was special. She was a factory-modified variant with experimental radio navigation gear that could have changed the war if we had 6 months more. We couldn't bring ourselves to blow her up. She was too beautiful to kill. He described the Black Flight of May 1945. Under the cover of a massive artillery barrage that distracted the local Allied patrols, Karl-Heinz had taken off from a crumbling runway near Munich. He flew at treetop level, hugging the contours of the Bavarian hills to avoid radar, his fuel gauges bouncing on empty. The farm road near Johann's family estate had been pre-marked with white sheets by a small ground crew of sympathetic engineers. It was a suicide landing, he admitted. The road was barely wider than the landing gear. I touched down at 160 kilometers per hour, the wind screaming through the canopy because I'd cracked it open to jump out if I hit a tree. Once the jet was safely on the ground, the special technical unit moved with surgical precision. They weren't just hiding a plane, they were preserving a legacy. Karl-Heinz himself had supervised the Cosmoline application, ensuring every bearing of the Jumo engines was packed with grease. They had struck a deal with Johann's grandfather, a man who valued gold and silence equally. We told the Americans we crashed her in the Chiemsee Lake, Karl-Heinz smiled thinly. We even threw some scrap metal into the water to make the splash look real. For 17 years, I walked past that barn twice a year during my summer hikes. I'd look at the padlock and wonder if the grease was still holding. I'm glad it was a farmer who found her, and not a scrap dealer. In 1962, the world of aviation restoration was in its infancy. Most wartime aircraft were viewed as scrap metal or, at best, static museum displays. But White 7 was different. Because of the obsessive preservation by Karl-Heinz and his team, the Messerschmitt Me-262 wasn't a wreck to be rebuilt. She was a sleeping giant that needed to be woken up. The restoration took place in a high-security hangar at the Messerschmitt Bau-Blom facility in Ottobrunn. The team was led by aging engineers who had originally built the jet in 1944. They approached the machine with a reverence that bordered on the religious. The first task was the Great Degreasing. For 3 weeks, teams used specialized solvents to melt away the thick, amber layers of Cosmoline. As the grease dissolved, it revealed a surface that was terrifyingly perfect. Even the rubber seals on the fuel lines, kept supple by the preservative spirits, hadn't perished. The greatest challenge, however, lay in the Jumo 004 turbojets. These were the world's first mass-produced jet engines, notoriously temperamental with an operational life of barely 25 hours. The restoration team disassembled both engines down to the last turbine blade. They found that the wooden bungs and wax tape had worked flawlessly. There wasn't a single speck of dust or a trace of oxidation inside the combustion chambers. It was like performing surgery on a patient who had been cryogenically frozen, one technician remarked. By the spring of 1963, White 7 was ready for her first engine run. A crowd of silent veterans gathered on the apron. As the starter cart hummed to life and the characteristic howl of the Jumo engines began to climb in pitch, a plume of blue-white smoke erupted from the exhausts. The engines didn't just cough, they roared. The ground vibrated with a frequency that many hadn't felt since the final days of the Reich. The test flight was scheduled for a clear morning in May. Karl-Heinz, though now a civilian, stood on the tarmac, his hands trembling as he watched a younger test pilot climb into the cockpit he had vacated 17 years prior. The jet taxied out, its nose-heavy stance looking as futuristic in 1963 as it had in 1945. When the pilot slammed the throttles forward, White 7 didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the runway and rotated, her swept wings slicing through the Bavarian air. As the landing gear tucked into the fuselage, the jet let out a predatory whistle that echoed off the Alps. For 20 minutes, the jet in the barn reclaimed the sky, performing high-speed passes that proved the genius of her design had survived the darkness of the shed. She wasn't just a machine anymore, she was a bridge between two eras, a silver ghost that had successfully navigated the long, dusty tunnel of time. The flight of White 7 in 1963 was more than a technical triumph. It was a cultural shockwave. In an era where the Cold War was defined by the scream of supersonic Century Series fighters and the looming threat of ICBMs, the sight of a 1944 Messerschmitt slicing through the clouds was a haunting reminder of how quickly the future becomes the past. But for the aviation world, White 7 represented something even more precious: the only surviving, airworthy bridge to the birth of the jet age. Following her successful restoration and a series of commemorative flights that drew thousands of spectators, the question of her permanent home became a matter of international heritage. While several Me-262s existed in museums in London, Washington, and Prague, they were all static shells, hollowed-out monuments with seized engines and cut wiring. White 7 was alive. She breathed kerosene and exhaled the thunder of the Jumo 004S. The decision was made to house her in the Deutsches Museum in Munich, but not as a silent exhibit tucked behind velvet ropes. Under a special agreement with the German government and Messerschmitt Me-262, she was maintained in flight-ready status for over a decade. She became the centerpiece of European airshows, a silver predator that could still outturn many of the early post-war Allied jets. As the late 1960s rolled into the 70s, the mechanical reality of the Me-262 began to set in. The Jumo engines, designed for a desperate war where materials like chromium and nickel were scarce, had reached the end of their safe operating life. The risk of a catastrophic engine failure, and the loss of the world's most significant historic jet, became too high. In 1971, White 7 performed her final, sunset flight. With Karl-Heinz watching from the tarmac and Johann, the farmer who found her, standing nearby in his Sunday best, the jet made one last low-level pass over the Bavarian countryside. The pilot pulled her into a steep, vertical climb, the twin engines howling a final goodbye before he throttled back and glided into a perfect landing. Today, White 7 sits in a place of honor, her swept wings gleaming under the museum lights. She is no longer covered in the brown grease of the barn, but her story remains etched into every rivet of her fuselage. She serves as a silent testament to a moment in history when technology moved faster than the world could comprehend. Visitors often stand before her, marveling at the shark-like nose and the futuristic profile, unaware that for 17 years, this mechanical marvel was hidden under a pile of hay and a canvas tarp. She remains the jet in the barn, the machine that refused to be scrap metal, protected by a farmer's silence and a pilot's devotion, waiting in the dark until the world was ready to see the future one more time.